So today I wanted to talk about some legislative terms. I've been reviewing the last couple of months bill drafting manuals from a majority of the states that publish them. And I've read about some of the terms that are used in these other states and what is the comparable term used here in California in the legislature and the legislative process. And so the following are some of the comparison terms that I've come across. California calls it a sunset date or a repeal when a statute is obviously repealed or terminated. Hawaii calls it a drop dead clause. North Dakota calls it a repealer clause. Washington State calls it an expiration date clause. Louisiana calls it an expiration clause or sometimes a termination clause. On another one, California calls it an urgency clause when a statute can take effect immediately. New Mexico calls it an emergency clause. Colorado calls it a safety clause. In California, we call it current law. Louisiana calls it present law. California calls it a special statute versus a general statute. Colorado calls this a declaration of special factors. This is an interesting one. California calls it a gut and amend bill when new contents are placed into an existing bill and the current contents were gutted or taken out. Hawaii calls this a gut and replace bill. New Mexico calls it a substitute bill. South Dakota calls it a hog house bill. Kentucky calls a variation of these a piggyback amendment. Colorado calls it an SEBEC amendment, which stands for strike everything below the enacting clause. And Minnesota calls it a delete everything amendment. California calls them bill authors, whereas almost all other states and Congress call them bill sponsors. In California, we call it amending an existing law. North Dakota calls it an amending clause. In California, we call it adding a new law or statute. North Dakota calls it a creating clause. California calls it a reporting provision when a law is required to be studied and reported back to the legislature. Colorado calls it an accountability clause. California calls it the Legislative Council's digest, where a summary of the bill is provided by the legislature's lawyer. South Dakota calls it a catch line. Illinois calls it an ABR, abbreviated synopsis of a bill. Louisiana calls it an abstract. Colorado calls it a section heading describing the particular code section's topic. Minnesota calls it a head note. California calls it the single subject rule, where a bill can only include one major subject or topic in the bill. Washington State calls it a one subject rule, as do Texas and Colorado. California calls it a companion bill when the same bill is introduced in both houses. Kentucky calls it a same as bill. California calls it a legislative intent statement when a bill contains one or more statements of intent. Minnesota calls it an interpretation clause. California calls it a budget trailer bill, a bill that trails the state budget bill to make statutory changes to implement the budget. Illinois calls it a trailer bill when a bill amends another earlier passed bill in the same session. California has 4 types of bills per the Constitution that are not subject to the people's power of referendum. Colorado's legislature can actually insert what they call a safety clause into any bill that precludes it from being subject to the people's power of referendum.